Thank you very much to the Mistress of Ceremonies for the very kind introduction, and also then to the Master of Ceremonies who repeated the introduction in Tamil. And I'm delighted to be here. And honourable members of Parliament, the National Council of Canadian Tamils, the Canadian Tamil Women's Development Organisation, the Canadian Tamil Youth Alliance, members of the media, without which this message cannot go very far beyond this room, and ladies and gentlemen, and of course, friends. The title of my talk is not human rights, it's not crimes against humanity, it's not even war crimes, it's about genocide. And I'm grateful that Olivia Chow, I beg your pardon. Sorry about that. I'm grateful that Olivia Chow and Mr. Singh made the first reference to genocide, because that is the focus. And if we are indeed all Tamils tonight and in the future, we need to focus on genocide. And I agree with Mark Adler. Canada is a great country. It is a special country. And as other members of Parliament have said, you are welcomed here, all of us, including the Irish. My own nephew lives in Hamilton and married a very nice Canadian girl some years ago. But I feel Canada needs to do more. We need to move beyond human rights. We need to look at genocide. Now, I'm proud to be associated with the Tamil diaspora. It's an extraordinary mix of talent, expertise, experience, and qualifications. Plus, fierce political power, and financial resources. And having heard what we heard tonight, I would urge the diaspora here in Toronto and elsewhere in this great country to work even harder and to work with those politicians that apparently you put into office, because they will listen to you if you tell them what needs to be done. And the commitment to stop the ongoing genocide in Tamil Eelam, to end the occupation, to restore human well-being in the traditional homeland, that's what we want to do. Firstly, I'd like to walk you through the People's Permanent Tribunal report, of which I was the co-chair in Bremen. Secondly, give you some thoughts on follow-up. And thirdly, share some ideas, perhaps, on how the diaspora can move forward here and around the globe. First, let me mention I was amused to be described by the Sunday Island as, quote, an ex-UN bigwig employed by the LTTE rump in Canada. Well, as my fellow Irishman Oscar Wilde once said, bad, in this case untrue publicity, is better than no publicity at all. So thank you, Sunday Island. However, now is the time, urgent time, for non-violent action. Non-violent action to end the occupation of Tamil Eelam before it's too late. Let me mention the report. The PPT is an NGO that was founded back in the days by Bertrand Russell to look at the war in Vietnam and take on the war crimes that were committed there, undoubtedly by the United States. And it's continued its work looking at 30 or 40 different cases. And now we've had 2 sessions of the tribunal looking at the plight of the Tamils, particularly the Tamils of Tamil Eelam. And it exists because the system, the establishment, the United Nations, has failed. This system has failed, as you were reminded tonight, in fact, the children of Iraq. But now I'm talking about the children and the people of Tamil Eelam. And we have failed those people. We've failed to deal with the crimes against humanity, the war crimes, and the human rights violations going back 50, perhaps 100 years. The Security Council, the Human Rights Council, the International Criminal Court, controlled by the 5 veto powers, are guilty of wars of aggression, guilty of war crimes, and even genocide. They themselves manufacture and sell some 85% of all weapons in the world today. And we entrust to them peace and security. There's something seriously wrong there. We need countries like Canada that have the guts and the courage to stand up and be different and take a step. Now, the Dublin meeting of the Tribunal in 2010, just after the tragic massacres of 2009, looked at war crimes, and you will not be surprised, in a matter of 2 or 3 days, found the Colombo regime guilty of war crimes. Since then, the Irish Forum for Tamils and the German Human Rights Association asked the PPPT to meet again. This time, the charge is genocide. Genocide by the state of Sri Lanka against the Tamil people, and complicity of other states in that genocide. Now, the genocide, for purposes of this tribunal, drew on the definition of the Convention on Genocide. And very quickly, and if you want a more thorough definition, you can actually look at the writing on the wall over there. The components are, and the one that is most familiar to all of you, is killing members of the group. In this case, the group is the Tamil people of the homeland of Tamil Eelam. Secondly is the committing of serious bodily harm to the target group, again, the Tamils, torture, rape, disappearance, extrajudicial killings, murder, and force against civilians. Third is inflicting conditions on the target group to make life impossible for some or all of the group. Again, that's what we have experienced in Tamil Eelam. Fourth, measures to prevent, to diminish, to limit the birth rate of a group. Again, that has happened. And fifthly, to separate children, Tamil children in this case, from their families or their orphans already, and have them taken into Sinhalese homes. Those are all the main components, the key components of genocide. The added words, which are very important when you need to explain this to others, is intentionality. Genocide must be an intentional process, strategy, policy against a group, ethnic or otherwise. And intentionality is key to the definition and to the guilt factor. Now, with those definitions in mind, the PPT tribunal in Bremen looked at the past. The documentation, Tamil and other witnesses came before us. We looked at the legislative discrimination, the constitutional changes, 50, perhaps 100 years of racism on the part of the Sinhalese. We looked at the data from some 150 pogroms against the Tamils over the years. We looked at the land grab and the settler program, which has taken away so much and destroyed so much of the lives of those who remain in Tamil Eelam today, the homeland. We looked at the warfare. We looked at the resistance to that warfare, the ceasefire and the peace process, sabotaged by the United States, the United Kingdom, and the EU, I'm sad to say, with the LTTE being branded as terrorists, a designation which of course excluded them from the all-important peace process, which had it been successful, of course we wouldn't be meeting tonight, because I think we would have had a peaceful, non-violent resolution to the tragedy that has taken place in the island that was Ceylon. The Colombo military, enhanced during the peace process, given weapons, sold weapons by many countries, and then assisted by the United States and the UK with training, equipment, aircraft, and weapons, plus psychological warfare techniques, plus Israeli advice on the occupation program, rather along the lines of their own occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. In 2009, prior to the May massacre at Mulivakau, satellite imagery was provided to the Colombo forces, enhanced, as I said, during the peace process, to determine where the LTTE forces were placed around the deep sea port of I can't remember the name. What's the deep sea port called? Tribunal. And the UN estimated after that massacre, particularly in May of 2009, that some 70,000, 80,000 people were murdered killed on the spot in safe zones and then shelled, as you know, by the military. And perhaps another 100 or 150 are missing or disappeared. The Bremen report explains fully the process of killing, the US and UK complicity, and I suggest you may want to read that fully if you are interested. Let us hope that the UN Human Rights Council, which is going to meet next month in Geneva, will demand a full international investigation. It has to be monitored by the United Nations. It has to be imposed upon Colombo. It has to be independent of Colombo in every respect. And those participating, perhaps in the diaspora, but particularly those in Tamil Eelam, must be provided protection, because we know that the Colombo policy under reconciliation is one of intimidation and fear and disappearance. That cannot be allowed to happen. Now, the results of this investigation, international, imposed, we don't quite know what shape it will take. I think I'm not overly optimistic, but I think it's a critical step forward. And I hope it will look at the issue of justice, and it will find that there are war crimes and acts of genocide committed by the military and by the commander-in-chief himself, I believe the president, and other officers. Find they're responsible and begin the process of punishment, and perhaps look at the issue of reparations and compensation to the people who've lost homes and lives and property and livelihoods. What the resolution may omit is the catastrophic, ongoing genocide. And that's really what I want to focus upon, I want you to think upon more than anything else. The past is the past. We can't bring back lives that have been lost, but we can look at what's happening today and try to deal with the future. And today we have in Tamil Eelam an ongoing genocide, which satisfies all of those 5 definitions I shared with you a minute ago. And action is urgently needed to stop and reverse the land grabs and theft, to stop the destruction of homes, livelihoods, dignity, identity, to stop the destruction of a family, village, community, and hope. Today, what do we find? We find houses destroyed, farmlands, families torn apart, the farming industry, farming life, I should say, perhaps undermined, destroyed, subsidized army production, undercutting Tamil agricultural produce. We find good land has been taken, both private and public land, and redistributed for either commercialized agriculture or used by the army for bases and for establishments. Good agricultural land. We find the fishing industry, which is so important. I believe some 600 fishermen have been killed, and the industry is now in the hands of others, assisted certainly by the Navy of Colombo. We find the public lands have been taken away and shared with those outside the Tamil community. We find that commerce and the markets are undermined by the Sinhalese. We find that foreign Buddhist shrines in the homeland of Hindus, Muslims and Christians. We find that the graveyards, ancient and less ancient, are being destroyed to wipe out Tamil presence and Tamil history, and perhaps even identity. We find 200,000 or thereabouts troops in the Tamil Eelam part of the island. Constant reminder of killings and rape and everyday harassment of civilians. Even the charity that many of you here have possibly sent to individuals, to families, has been taken and diverted by the army. We find that Tamil women have been implanted with birth control devices, and the fact that these devices are permanent has not been explained. We find Tamil orphans have been separated and given to other families. And we find that widows have been raped and prostituted and forced into marriages. Life is precarious. There's no doubt about that, and there's nowhere to hide. The Bremen report has made recommendations for the United Nations to investigate fully the killing of the past, the war crimes, there's no reference to genocide. That, of course, is a very great missing piece. The UN has asked its agencies to avoid using development as a cover for replacing Tamil farmers, for moving them off the land and putting in commercialized agriculture, which unemploys Tamils and takes away their livelihoods. The EU has been asked to support the investigation that we've spoken about and support the UN in the ongoing genocide and reach out to the Tamil community and refrain from accepting these US-driven terrorist designations that are so dangerous and so damaging to the future. Somebody suggested today that one move we should make is to remove retroactively that designation, so everybody who supported perhaps the political and social programs and even the resistance of the LTTE would be freed from that determination that is a terrorist. We've asked Germany to ask the non-violent negotiated resolution that the EU has supported in the past to be returned and used as a device for the future. And of course, Colombia has been asked to accept the outcome of the tribunal, accept its responsibility for genocide, and stop covering up the crimes in our media and in overseas missions and through the politics of international communications. And finally, the EPT suggests that the world community commemorate the Tamil victims of genocide on 19 May each year, calling it the Mulivakal Commemoration Day. After the tribunal, with members of the Irish, US, German, Swiss, British, and now Canadian diaspora, and with members of Parliament, I have been lucky to be party to various meetings, including those in Ottawa. And we met with the three main political parties in Ottawa, and we listened carefully. And also met with the diaspora, young people, women, the elderly, and those who've worked so hard for so many years to protect the interests of the Tamil community here, but of course back home in the homeland. I'm a little disappointed, I must tell you, in government response here in Canada. I accept this is a special country. I know the great history of welcoming victims and welcoming all sorts of people from around the world. But I think we need more. I think we need to move away from human rights. That is simply not adequate. We need to move and look at genocide that exists today. That's the challenge. And as we've heard already from some of our speakers, that the diaspora here in Canada has political power and sends members to Parliament or to the local council here in Toronto or elsewhere, I would suggest you use that political power. One model you might want to consider is the very effective Israeli lobby in the United States. Nothing happens vis-à-vis Israel without that lobby at work. Nothing happens vis-à-vis the Palestinians without that lobby going to work. I think there's a model there that the diaspora could well use in this country. I was delighted that Canada had the courage to boycott the Commonwealth meeting in Colombo. But you do agree, we need more than that. And after all, we had the sight of Prince Charles representing, I guess, the Queen. And Charles is, after all, you know, the main arms dealer of the royal family, selling BAE weapons to the regime in Colombo, which are now being used, or have been used and will be used, I dare say, against the Tamils. That clearly is not acceptable. There is no excuse but to look at the present situation. And the difficulty we have with the ongoing genocide, that happily the great violence, the massacres are behind us. But it's a slow death of genocide. It's insidious, it's perhaps even subtle, but not subtle, of course, for those who are struggling in Talalila, as we sit here in comfort in Toronto. And we cannot allow other problems, other pressures to divert the United Nations or the United States or countries like Canada and the EU. We know there are difficulties in South Sudan, in the Central African Republic, in Syria, in Iraq, and various other places. But that doesn't justify not paying attention to the genocide ongoing in Sri Lanka. Now, the impressive diaspora I have been happy to meet and fortunate to meet has a huge capacity. It needs to be, in my view, very well managed and focused, and continue to work with the government here in Canada and bring more changes. I would like to see that the global diaspora be equally focused, and that the global diaspora would begin to speak with one voice. When you move around, as I have done recently, and have spoken to diasporas of individual countries, it's quite clear that there's not one voice. And I think one voice would be more effective. So I think global cooperation, better sharing of information and ideas would enhance the work of the diaspora worldwide. I would suggest better gender balance. I dare say this is a sensitive issue, but I'm going to speak anyway, in the leadership, because even in the NCTT, I don't find women on the board. Well, maybe I'm wrong, but if I'm wrong, well, gladly so. But the fact is, women do make up 50% of the population. And when I worked in the United Nations for 3 years, I was the head of human resources for the UN worldwide. The argument was that I made that to make a decision, a management decision, without including women was not likely to be the best decision, because women have unique and extraordinary experience. And I've just met with some young and very young Tamil women here in Toronto, and believe me, these are serious people. We need to respect them, and they need to be given membership on these various Tamil diaspora entities such as the NCCT, and I would really encourage that. Gender balance is terribly important. It gives you better results. I believe the diaspora should perhaps consider that the human rights resolution we're looking forward to may not do what we want, but it should be exploited as much as possible to raise additional issues. We need to look at other devices, however, and one of those would be a referenda, I should say. One has been proposed, which would be to invite the United Nations to manage a global referenda in Tamil with global support, and again with a mandate, and again with all the protection that such a referendum in Tamil would require. But I'd like to suggest, prior to that, it might be viable to hold a referendum amongst the 1.2 million diaspora around the world. Carefully worded, you could find from that process where everybody stands. Because I find, and you're aware more than I, that within the diaspora, there are those who want to return tomorrow, and there are those who never want to return. And there's probably many stages in between. There are those with young children who are not apparently learning the story of Tamil and the genocide as perhaps they should. There are those who are very much aware. There are women's groups concerned about issues of growing up in Canada and retaining the Tamil culture and yet being good Canadians. All of those difficulties need to be uncovered, and the plan for the future needs to be understood. We could listen effectively, it seems to me, to this extraordinary diaspora which is all over the globe. I would suggest you need to consider the right of return. It must be protected not just for IDPs, of course, in the country itself, but for those of you who are in the diaspora and do plan to return. That right of return must be protected. You might want to consider setting up something like a government in exile. The model for that would be, in my view, the ANC, which was set up by people like Mandela while South Africa was still an apartheid state. In the United Nations Development Program, where I used to work in those days, we had projects in Mozambique and Zambia with the ANC in anticipation that they would indeed return to South Africa and would indeed take over South Africa and govern it as they did. That's something you might want to think about. You might want to set up a roadmap for rebuilding Tamil for all to see. I met with some young people today in university downtown, and we discussed the possibility of setting up a model for Tamil Eelam in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. It'll be a long process. But there are models. You could look at Singapore, for example. When I look at the diaspora here, and every second person I talk to is into IT, you could visualize a Tamil Eelam, which an agricultural base, possibly fisheries, but also an IT industry, finance, insurance, banking, all sorts of roles could be played. A Tamil Eelam that became a member of the ASEAN group, for example, with 500 million civilians, inhabitants, potential customers, could be a very viable state. And I believe that a white paper, so to speak, to show how this could be done, how we can stop the occupation, end the land theft, stop the land grabs, and manage and finance something new, something different. And consider that one island and 2 states is not just a dream. It could be a reality. It needs serious thought. And I would argue that one island and 2 states, well supported by the international community and great countries like this one, Canada, could both move forward together, could both be enhanced. Prosperity could be spread in both of these 2 states on one island. And they themselves could cooperate and share in exports and infrastructure, and airlines and all the other things that modern states need. And in fact, I have a model close to home. In the north of Ireland, as you may know, there are still 6 counties which are part of Britain, and the rest of the country, 26 counties, are a republic. Now, with Irish-American pressure and the British government and the government of the Republic of Ireland, effectively they have imposed upon the 6 counties of the north, made up of Republicans and made up of British, people inclined to the British way of life, we have imposed a coalition government. And that coalition government is headed by 2 men, typically, I suppose, but 2 men, one of whom is a Republican and one of whom is of the British inclination. And they work together, and they run the departments, they have an administrator, and they make it work. It does work, it can work. And that's an imposition. And it seems to me someday, with different circumstances, maybe, who knows what will happen in Colombo this year or next, you could visualize something similar happening on the island of Ceylon, that would be imposed by the international system, endorsed, enforced maybe even by the states, Britain and others, a coalition government of Tamils and Sinhalese. But that doesn't perhaps really answer your concern. It doesn't perhaps protect the identity and the desire for a nation state representing the Tamil people. So maybe that's another way you want to go. But I think the diaspora should be urged and encouraged to think big. There isn't much time, in my view. This is a very urgent matter. It needs your attention and it needs your work right now. And one of the tragedies of the collapse of the peace process is the LTTE lost the opportunity that the ANC enjoyed. In other words, the leadership was murdered, extrajudicially killed, whereas Mr. Mandela came out of prison, a terrorist, became a politician, a leader, a president, and we began to see that men who do use arms and do resist occupation and violence can also become leaders and politicians and effective people. And as you know, resistance against occupation is legal. It's legal under international law. It's legal under the United Nations Charter. I would recommend, finally, that the diaspora only speak in terms of non-violence. I think we've seen that violence has failed us, failed you, failed all of us in many places around the world, including my own small country. We need a non-violent way of moving forward. Revenge may be nice, but it's not practical. We need to work with everybody here. And we need to find a policy that will stop the genocide, will enhance both communities, and we can move forward as is so absolutely, desperately needed. Violence doesn't work. It doesn't work in Syria or Libya or Iraq or elsewhere. And we need to see a change. And I believe that the Tamil people at home and overseas can prosper and live without fear, in peace, if we work towards that goal using Gandhian methods as opposed to warfare and violence and killing and massacre and death. It may take time, it will take time, it will cause pain and compromise. We have this love and perseverance, and with optimism, with hope, and by creating opportunities, employing courage, nothing is impossible. Thank you.